Hi guys, I just had an interesting conversation with Luke Stanley about motion guidelines. And Luke is an awesome guy. Aside the fact that he's also very knowledgeable about this, it was really insightful, and I can't wait for you to watch the video. So this video is in three parts, and this is the first part. So I'd just like to start off with you just giving us a brief introduction about yourself. Um, we are here for motion guidelines, definitely. So who you are and how you just went about starting motion guidelines.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Luke. I'm based in the UK, and I've been working with brands doing motion guidelines for just about 2 years now. I started off as a freelance motion designer, and the kind of style of work meant I was working a lot with tech clients and doing a lot in like the UX motion space. And through that work, I became aware of like motion systems that were used often in UX motion work by tech companies. Kind of saw the value of that in terms of how that worked as a system to apply to different components and elements of websites and apps. And the common thing I was seeing as an issue was that the brands, when they approach motion, they would, for a project, they would hand over the brand guidelines and you would know exactly visually how it should look. But when it came to motion, most of the time it was up to you as a motion designer, how you wanted that to work, how you wanted animations to move and so on. And so kind of saw a gap in trying to, work with brands to basically help them see it from a brand perspective, how they approach motion, so that they use motion with intentionality, with reason, so that it reflects the brand and that it's applied consistently. So kind of discovered that I kind of really wanted to move down this path 2 years ago. And then it all stemmed from just starting to post on LinkedIn about this area. And then, from there started, getting clients who are interested, and it's kind of gone from there really. So it's been a case of kind of slowly growing, and then, now doing this full time. Working with brands to build motion guidelines for them. So it's been a fun adventure so far.
Yeah, it's really been fun. We met via LinkedIn, and seeing all you've done so far in the last 2 years within the space has actually been very commendable. I mean, I would personally say this: you're one of the people who give me some form of clarity when it comes to motion guidelines and how to go about it. Because I'm interested in it, obviously, but there was no much how would I put it? No much resources per se as to how to go about it and what to do. So seeing seeing your work and seeing you talk about it as often as you do, really has been very helpful. And you touched my next question a bit, and that's so I would like you to, as wide or as far as you can go, what the importance of motion guidelines is, as wide as you can take the question, the importance of motion guidelines.
Yeah. I think the reason why I feel now for brands, especially sort of in the last few years, it's now quite an important thing for them to think about is just because of the availability that there is to use motion across so many different touch points now. And I think, 5-10 years ago, there wasn't much opportunity to really use motion as there is now. And I think it's being used very frequently. Obviously brands recognize that it is a great way of engaging, but it's also, it's another level in which they can communicate their brand. And there's just so many areas now that you can cover. But with that comes with, scaling and creating lots of content. And that's where the risk comes in terms of inconsistencies, the risk in terms of, is this actually reflecting the brand properly? And I think there's quite a lot of education to go on, which is kind of like partly what I've been trying to do on LinkedIn, really, in terms of trying to sort of show how the way you move something, can actually reflect the personality of a brand, or it can reflect kind of the way it moves will engage the type of audience that they want to connect with. And I think I think people very quickly, usually with motion, they just want to sort of make it feel, the classic words like dynamic or, whack on easy ease, and then it sort of just feels much nicer. And they're like, cool, there it is. But it's like, actually, there's so much more that you can do. And there's so much more in the way that you move something that can really, express a brand. And like one of the ones I always use as an example is, for example, if you were trying to engage like a younger audience, the likelihood is the way you animate something's going to have a lot more pace to it. Things are going to change much more quickly. They may even, will probably have very fast entries into scene in terms of the way you ease something into shot, because it's all sort of got a pace about it. And because that's the kind of thing that's really going to engage with a younger audience in terms of how they could, engage with the content. Whereas I've worked on projects for much more premium brands, and the thing that they love is more to do with just giving things time to come into scene. And sometimes you're literally just doing opacity, and then you're just doing a very slight scale of a product coming into scene. But it feels really premium, it feels really luxury. And so then that's another way in which you can express something that, and then for that type of audience. So there's so much that you can do, which is the great thing about motion. And I think that's the thing, is sort of opening people's eyes to kind of, what that's all about. And then framing it in something such as motion guidelines, to be able to kind of help people in how they apply it and how they can, go about doing this for their brand.
Okay, that sounds cool and really interesting. How do you typically approach a motion guideline project?
So it's, basically the aim of a motion guideline is all about kind of making sure that at the end of it, that they've got basically some sort of form of documentation, as well as also an understanding of how their brand should be. It's also something that is a reference point for the brand and the rest of their team to be able to understand how they actually apply it. But the thing that I do, which I think is really important, is actually trying to apply strategy a lot more into thinking about how should their brand move. So before I even start animating anything, I usually will always do some sort of strategy type work, where it's basically a case of doing the kind of stuff that anyone would do, which is just really getting to know the brand, understanding who they are, going through the brand guidelines and so on. But it's also going down a path of like doing work that is similar to what you would do for a rebrand or a branding project, where you're trying to find words that define what does that brand look like in motion. You're also trying to sort of strategize in terms of like, well, what deliverables are they aiming to achieve? What are they wanting to do with motion and so on? And then another part of it is also doing audit work, I think is really crucial, because that side of it is really effective in terms of just reflecting on how they're using motion so far. There will always be things that they have already that are working. I don't think I've ever worked with a brand where I'm just like, everything is wrong. So there will be stuff that they've got that will be working well, but it's also an opportunity for them also to learn and clearly see where there are inconsistencies, or actually we want to do something different with type, or we want to do something different with the way that we do transitions between scenes. And so all of that work is really helpful to kind of help set things up when you start thinking about motion guidelines and how you're going to animate the brand across other assets. And then another part as well is also doing mood boards, which is obviously, again, another sort of process that most motion designers will do. But it's just really helpful, again, to just kind of see opportunity of where and how you could animate a brand. And then that moves into kind of the other steps, which are sort of more, practical ways of everything you've done beforehand in terms of understanding how you want to animate that brand. And the other key aspect with motion guidelines is that it's about kind of trying to break things down into sort of different elements to look at, as I was mentioning about like typography, for example, or how does the brand use imagery or pieces of content like video and so on within animation. Do they transitions, logo idents? There may be even sort of designs and patterns that they use within the brand. How do they use those? So those are all reflected in the audit, and then that's moved into then when you start animating, you start thinking about all these areas, and then kind of going from there in terms of applying that moving forwards. So yeah, so basically once you've done that strategy and audit stuff, it's then kind of moving into testing, which is basically a case of just bringing in very simple design elements to work with, like just like one type layout, or it could be a couple of transitions or some shapes to work with and so on. And it's kind of the opportunity where you can test out what I say are 3 areas that are really important when it comes to sort of discovering principles as part of the motion guidelines, which are the easing curves, which are a big part of it in terms of really bringing, that character to how motion moves. Something I usually try and encourage is to try and say, to scale down how many easing curves you're using, because I think sometimes an animation can just be approached by you just make the easing curve work with what you're building as you go along. But the thing thinking from a brand perspective is you want to think about consistency. And so a key thing is really trying to maybe just look at using like between 3 and 5 sort of main easing curves that you would use across different animations. And so, for example, you'd like to have one easing curve that you would use across different type elements that you would use. But that easing curve could also potentially be used for the transitions and so on. But anyway, in testing, it's a great way to kind of just play with the graph and understand how you want things to work. And then the other 2 things are the attributes, which are obviously, for those who work in motion, it's the obvious things of like, do you use scale? Do you use position? Do you use opacity? And just sort of thinking which ones you want to apply to certain elements. And then finally, the timings, which I think is a real sort of icing on the cake in terms of if something feels right. So, for example, if it was a type animation, it was word by word, you decided that you want to use position and they're going up on the y-axis to bring each word in. The timings is kind of the point of where you're starting to think, okay, how long should it take to get from state A to state B in terms of finishing its finished state? And just like playing with frames to see how long you want that to be or how short. It's amazing how much difference it can make just from like extending it by 5 frames. But also then you can think about the timings between each word coming up and things like that. So those are kind of generally the 3 areas that you consider in testing. And then once you're kind of feeling clearer about that, it's kind of then a case of building out all these design elements that you've gone through for the brand, and then moving that into then actually building out content, so social media posts, or it could be pieces of content for a website. It could be for an app. It depends, obviously, the touch points they're looking to, but it's kind of the opportunity of all the elements working together, and seeing how that works and so on. And some of that will also sometimes I'm requested to then make some templates as well. So for social, for example, they might have a certain layout that they'll use on a regular basis, and they just want to be able to swap out the type. They want to swap out the images or the colors of the images and things like that. So making that available to them. And then it finishes with documentation, which best can be described as obviously strongly influenced by brand guidelines, but obviously, is very different in terms of how things are described. The way I try and approach it is actually trying to make it simpler than the sort of guideline you would get in UX kind of work, because I think from previously doing animation in that space, it was very detailed in terms of all the different things that you needed to include, which is fair enough if it was an app or a website and so on. But at sort of brand level content, I think it's trying to make something that's accessible to not only motion designers, but hopefully to other people in your team, in the marketing team, in the creative team that can kind of engage with this documentation. And included in there will be kind of the details of what you've decided for, say, a type animation, what easing curve you decided to go with, and then detailing what attributes you went with, the durations of things, and then obviously reflecting examples of those animations inside the guidelines as well. But it's trying to sort of just focus on the key things that people need to take forwards with in terms of making the animations in the future, because the usual situation is either it's in-house and they just need that documentation to work with, to know when they need to make animations, but also it's also for opportunities when they're working externally with freelancers and studios and stuff like that. And the final thing I'd say is that the thing with motion guidelines is it's not a strict rule book that you have to stick to for everything, which I think people can be a bit surprised about, because brand guidelines, that's very much the case. But for motion guidelines, there's certain levels of content where it's good just to literally replicate what's in the guideline and then apply it to animation. But for example, if you were making an explainer, the likelihood is you're going to probably want to customize a bit and put a new twist on it. Or it could be, obviously, you might be using sort of more physics and stuff like that. And so, yes, for any type that's included in there, it will strongly reference the motion guidelines. But there may be that when they make an explainer or other types of content that are more bespoke, that there is that flexibility to obviously, tweak kind of how they approach that, if that makes sense. So yeah, so there's a bit more sort of a flexibility, I think, that's needed for motion, just because in terms of how it works and how people use this at the moment. So, but yeah, anyway, there's my very long answer for the process of kind of how I approach this type of work.
Yeah, it's actually a really helpful answer and brings up a lot of questions in mind. And I like the fact you mentioned, or the last point you mentioned, where the guideline is not supposed to be like a strict rule book for everything motion done with the company. It can be tailored to something specific, but some other things they are allowed to explore, which the guidelines will give like a foundation. Out of all these, I have some questions from all you just said so far. Out of all these, the processes, which would you say is the most challenging for you, part of it, and why?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's probably not like a certain stage of the process. It's more the main thing is you want to make sure at the end of when you've worked with a brand that they fully understand everything moving forwards in terms of how they apply it and so on. And I think it depends the situation in terms of if you're working with a brand who have motion designers and have a good understanding of it, or whether they are a brand that are quite new to using motion. And I think there's the element of sort of educating in terms of why it's good to go through these strategy processes, because that can be a challenge sometimes. Is sort of people sometimes are a bit like, do we really need to do all this stuff at the beginning? Can we not just crack on and start animating and start making this guideline? But I think I just sort of always say back to them of like, when you've worked on a rebrand and stuff, you've seen the value of what strategy does in terms of giving you clarity of how you've made your brand visually and how your brand works in terms of, any communication it does. Motion is the same, and it's something that I think, does need to be considered more. So I think in answer to your question, I think it's just sort of the process of kind of helping people get on board with sort of thinking about motion in this way. And then allowing it to be in the space of being part of the visual identity of a brand. Because the main thing with motion is it's not a separate thing. Motion should be part of the overall visual identity in terms of the way it's designed, the logos, the colors, the font selections and so on. Motion's kind of part of that, and that's kind of how it should work, is it's kind of interwoven with those things rather than it being a separate thing. So it's sort of trying to bring that thinking in from where they've done elsewhere for the brand and bring that into motion, really. And that's probably sometimes a bit of a challenge, just sort of, going through educating that kind of thing. So, so that's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Something else that came to mind, the way you explained your process, it sounded like you have like a structure for how you approach it. So my question is, how did that come about? Did it come with working with clients that you now found out that this structure? Did it come with study? Or how did you go about? Because one of the reasons why we're doing this is to provide a guide for intentional motion, basically. That's what the motion systems is all about. So how did you come about structurizing your process when it comes to motion guidelines?
Yeah, it was like that, like you said, there's not much education on this at all online. It's very much a case of I think before I started working on this, there were sort of some examples of like Google and their material stuff in terms of detailing about how they do motion. Obviously I had my experience in UX motion and stuff. So I guess there was a bit from that maybe came into this in terms of what were the key things to put into documentation. But in terms of the process of it all, I think it was a case of when I came to do, so I did like some tester projects myself, which I think helped me kind of work out what are good things to do to get you from A to B. But I think it was a learning process being on projects, to be honest. I think it was a case of like discovering where there were gaps and stuff, which, yeah, it was a little bit challenging at times because you want to be able to like, know from the start, right, this is how it works. This is what you need to do. But when it's something that there isn't much information on online, you can obviously use your experience of where you got to being in the place of working with someone, but there is elements of it that you just learn along the way, to be honest. I think now I feel very clear in terms of how I work on stuff, but it did take a little while when I first started out, really just trying to sort of reflect after the project and go, okay, what worked, what didn't, and where do I need to add things to help elevate this. And I think you learn as well from just working with brands, because I think each project is quite different from the next in terms of ones I work on. And so every brand has a different approach to sort of, even like the documentation itself, there's always something different that a brand requests. And sometimes like from doing that, you're like, oh, that's actually another thing that would be good to add to my next project. Or sometimes you might be like, I'm not so sure, but I'll do it for them because that's what they wanted. And that's helpful for them. But you kind of just learn along the way in terms of just sort of, discovering what works best. But yeah, I think it is one of those things where, like yourself, I think motion designers are seeing the need for this, but unfortunately there's not been lots of it at the moment. So, but I've definitely seen the last few years brands embracing motion more than ever before in terms of thinking at it at this sort of brand level. And so I think hopefully in time there'll be more information in the future.